Thank you, Dr. Miller, and thanks, Karen, for, again, helping get everything set up for our third class here. As you guys remember, I'm trying to kind of incorporate different artifacts into each class because that's one of my favorite things to do with my students that I get to see every day. And one of the things that I thought I would bring in is a Wheeling Pittsburgh steel jacket that one of my students gave me about 10 years ago, and they just randomly popped in one day and said, hey, I found this jacket in the closet and my mom said she didn't want it. Do you want it? And I thought, well, sure, this is really cool to be able to have. And, I've had this for a while and really haven't thought too much about it other than it's just a neat artifact and has the front there, Wheeling Pittsburgh steel again. And one of the things I noticed was the buttons on it, they're just worn out. Like, the paint is stripped off the buttons just from the years of wear and use. And I really feel like that tells a story. And then some of the other things that I've kind of collected over the years or people have just given me too are other items of vintage clothing. So you have a Wheeling High School shirt there from the class of '59, maybe when they had a reunion or something like that and had t-shirts made. And someone gave me a Wheeling High School track sweater, with the letter there with the track logo. And again, like these things kind of started piling up. I started acquiring more things, and one of the cooler things that I found was a Wheeling High School football sweater from 1931. And this was so well documented. I have like who wore it and who he married, and they were married for 56 years. But one of the cool things about this item is it came from Kennedy's Hardware. And imagine, going to Wheeling High School and, getting sporting goods or your high school sweater from a place like Kennedy's Hardware. So I think that kind of tells the story of how hardware stores were so much different and meant so much more to a community back then. And imagine, again, just buying a sweater from something like that. And it's so cool that that tag is still on there. And so vintage clothing, all right? So again, being a high school teacher, seeing all kind of kids walk by me, and this year, more than ever, I've noticed kids wearing like vintage clothing from the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and like I started noticing this so much, I started stopping kids and saying, like, where did you get that like Wheeling Jesuit shirt at? Like I can tell that that's old, and they started telling me about these stores in Wheeling, and so there's one in Center Market called Outdated Threads. And then there's another one that was in Martins Ferry for a time period, but he just recently moved to Wheeling and Market Plaza, and it's called Two Times. And so from Outdated Threads, though, a couple weeks ago, I walked in there and found a Wheeling Pittsburgh steel hat. And at first I thought, do I really need this? Okay, like I have enough Wheeling stuff. But for some reason, I liked that it said Truck Division. It just had something a little extra to it. And one of my friends, after me like talking about how much I liked it, went and got it for me as a present. And so I thought, well, this is perfect for the artifacts for this class. Just to kind of show that, like you guys probably have some of these things sitting around in your closet and may not think that they're that important, or you may have forgotten about them, but it's sort of becoming a trendy thing for people to either wear or display, or for maybe people to even like reproduce something like this. And another item that I picked up a long time ago just on eBay is a shirt from the Nail City Brewing Company. And at first I thought, I'm never going to wear this. It looks like it's, been pretty beat up and everything. But the more I thought about it, I like the history of breweries in Wheeling. And this is when Nail City, or where the Artisan Center is now, they had like a microbrewery going in the 90s. And their logo is actually 3 nails, which is just a really great design. And then on the back of it, it has like the new pride of Wheeling in the logo. But the best part about this shirt is it's going to be hard for me to hold the mic and probably show you this at the same time, but it has nails on the sleeves. So, again, I'm kind of glad I picked this up because it's something that just is a cool display item, but I also think it's something that you could reproduce just for fun, or kind of borrow the idea of the graphic design that went into something like this. So, if this sort of stuff interests you, I would definitely encourage you guys to go down and check out some of these shops just to browse around, or again, to start thinking about maybe what you have, that really does tell a story. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of start class by sharing a couple of those things there. Also, while I'm thinking about it, at the end of class, I've enjoyed all of our conversations, and at the beginning of this class this morning, so many of you came up to me and shared like pictures on your phones or stories that you had, or you shared different like family heirlooms or documents with me and things like that. It really means a lot, and that's really what this class is all about for the community. So I think it's awesome that everyone has a voice to share those things. So kind of moving on here, if you guys remember from a couple of my other classes, I like to start with my students with the wheeling warm-up. And today's theme is going to be centered around transportation, and wheeling is sort of like a gateway to the West. So I wanted to start with kind of a random transportation fact here about a bridge. And a couple years ago, again, one of my students said, Mr. Stanton, you love talking about bridges. They're like, you just go on and on about all these different bridges in wheeling. And I said, well, yeah, I guess I do. And he goes, you ought to have a wheeling warm-up, or you ought to label them called Bridge Edition, okay? And I thought, well, that's kind of funny. I like his idea. And so throughout the semester with my students, I'll sprinkle in, wheeling warm-ups that are specifically about different bridges. Some still in use, and some have been demolished like this one. So this is in the background. You're looking at the Raymond Brewing Company. And this would have been located in East Wheeling, across Wheeling Creek. But from the Raymond Brewing Company across the creek, there was what was called the Manchester Bridge. And I have a feeling that some of you guys are going to remember that bridge and using that bridge. I don't remember it, but I'm fascinated by the photos of this little bridge that took you from such a huge brewery complex across over to East Wheeling. And the owner of this brewery, Anton Raymond, lived in East Wheeling. So, I mean, he would have crossed this bridge every single day going back and forth to his brewery. And it's really interesting when you learn of what's left of this and what happened to this area of Wheeling once the bridge was removed. But here's another image of the Raymond Brewing Company, and you can see the bridge there. And again, all the different buildings of the brewery. And then that's basically all that's left of the brewery today, what would have been probably the brew house, and then there were caves that went back into the hillside where they would have stored the beer. And this is a photo that I took, and I'm standing on just what's left of that bridge. But here's a later picture of the Manchester Bridge, and of course Prohibition would end the Raymond Brewing Company, and they would never resurface after Prohibition, but the buildings of that brewery were used for a lot of other businesses that, again, some of you guys are probably going to recognize or remember going to. So again, you got the Manchester Bridge there. And this is just kind of a Google Earth view of kind of where we're at, because you guys probably kind of know where I'm talking about, but when I try to explain this to kids, they have no idea what I'm saying. And I have to, again, bring up Google Earth and walk them through this. But you have Route 2 over here on this side, and when you're passing over that, you'll sometimes maybe notice those abandoned buildings, especially more with the leaves off. And then again, like East Wheeling is just going to be over here across Wheeling Creek. But again, another image of the bridge. And again, a great photograph of the Raymond Brewing Company there. And then Bethlehem would be up on the hill. And then this is all that's left of the Manchester Bridge, just simply the abutment that sits on each side of Wheeling Creek. So it's just kind of a neat area to go drive by and explore. And you would have to follow Rock Point Road. Just Google Rock Point Road and go to you basically can't drive anymore. And this is where you'll be able to find where this bridge once sat. And from what I've found, I mean, probably sometime in the mid to late 1980s, this bridge was taken out. And I think people probably talked about putting a bridge back into this location, but it's actually never developed. But this is a great photo, again, of what that bridge looked like probably before or shortly before it was demolished. And so, I mean, this is just kind of my random fact for students, because this is how people always describe the Manchester Bridge to me, as just being a back way into Wheeling. So, if there was traffic on National Road or Interstate 70 was a little backed up, you could, cross Washington Avenue and take Rock Point Road. We're talking kind of about like the Tunnel Green area, and have another way into East Wheeling. So I love this warm-up because I get to talk about a bridge, but I also get to talk about the Raymond Brewing Company and just how important this area was to Wheeling. And again, I mean, it's kind of sad, but you know, when you take out a bridge, you know, this whole area, for the most part, the businesses and things like that sort of dried up. But it's a whole little neat area of Wheeling that students don't even really know existed. So yeah, there's my Wheeling warm-up. And what I want to get into today, again, is just information about transportation in Wheeling. And river traffic is going to be extremely important to Wheeling as it develops. But basically, when you came to Wheeling, you had to wait for a ferry to cross the main channel of the Ohio River onto the island and then cross the back channel, or again go across the main channel. But you would have seen barges or ferries operating to take people into what is now Ohio. And you also would have seen a lot of these on the Ohio River of what we call packet boats. And probably, again, one of my favorite boats to talk about because they didn't care what they looked like, okay? When you look at like real photos of these, you see all different shapes and sizes and forms of construction. But boats like this would have been made in Pittsburgh, Wheeling, and filled up with cargo, sent down the Ohio River to Parkersburg or Marietta, but then for the most part dismantled once they got to those locations. The owners of those boats would have sold the lumber, bought a horse, rented a horse, whatever, but then came back up and did the whole thing over again because, again, you could only go south on the river. You weren't going to, you know, maneuver one of those up the river. So it's really a neat form of transportation. And again, like you could have seen all sorts of different shapes and sizes of these boats on the Ohio River, hauling all sorts of different types of cargo. And if you guys remember from, I think, my first class, this is a packet boat from a much later date, but in this boat, you can see that you have, you know, hogs and you have cattle and you have boxes from the Schmulbach Brewing Company of Wheeling being sent on this boat. So river transportation would be huge. And again, just another great photo that shows you have a large boat there in the background, but then you have a rowboat. You have something that almost looks like a taxi or something that people could have got on and maybe crossed the river. And then a smaller packet boat. And that's the old steel bridge in the background there that crossed from Wheeling to Wheeling Island. And then just another fascinating photo of all the different activity that you could have seen on the river in the late 1800s. And I'm not really sure what's going on in the photo, but whatever it is, it must be pretty exciting or important for everyone to be surrounded by what is today Heritage Port. And this is one of those photos that I'll show my students and they'll be like, that's not Wheeling. And I'm like, no, it is. Like, you know, where you go to a festival at Heritage Port today, that's what was once there. And again, you know, you can see all those different types of boats. I mean, there's a guy, again, on a rowboat there. You have river boats. You can see the steam coming from those boats and just all the people coming down to observe whatever is going on for that particular event. So again, if you want to learn about river traffic, see me afterwards because I can direct you to some fascinating books about steamboats and all the different ones that would have came through Wheeling and who owned them and again what they were shipping on the river. But I also want to talk about the National Road. And I'm sure many of you have taken the National Road just to get here today, or you will at some point. Some of you probably live along the National Road. And the National Road's one of my favorite topics because it was America's first highway. And that road coming through Wheeling is huge for our development. And a family that played a huge role in that is the Shepherd family. And I always ask my students, I'm like, you know, do you know the old stone house like in Elm Grove or the Shriner's Mansion? You know, do you know what I'm talking about? And they look at me and they're like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And then I'm like, well, the house across from McDonald's. And then they're like, oh, yeah, that house, okay? So the house across from McDonald's, all right, that is known as the Shepherd Mansion or Monument Place. And you have Moses and Lydia Shepherd. They meet on the frontier. Both of their families were at Fort Henry, at the battles of Fort Henry. Lydia Shepherd, her maiden name would be Boggs. And Moses inherits this property from his father. And they would have a fort approximately where the house is sitting right now. There was originally a fort. And they would build this stone house in 1798, which has got to be one of the oldest stone houses really in the state of West Virginia. And they were a very wealthy social couple. And Moses, I mean, he must have had some engineering, capabilities to be able to build something like that. And when you think about it, in the late 1700s, most people were building homes out of logs, okay? They're just putting together some sort of dwelling. They're building a house out of stone. They also had a stone barn. They had a distillery. And this would have been, imagine, a Southern-style plantation. They had slaves, and they would also have a tavern on the property. And again, like Elm Grove was basically all of theirs. That was all of their land, and it was a self-contained little community there. But they also, again, had a lot of wealth, a lot of power. They took numerous trips back and forth to Washington, D.C. for shopping and socializing. And I think they always kind of wanted to have an influence in government. And when Thomas Jefferson authorizes the construction of the National Road in 1808, I think they see that as a way to get involved. And what would ultimately end up happening is they would befriend Congressman Henry Clay, who Claysville is named after, and through his influence, Moses Shepherd would be awarded a contract to build the National Road through what is today West Virginia. And this would be huge because they would play a role in routing the road, to make sure it goes past their house. And just a little bit more about them. They're buried up at Stone Church Cemetery. Their monument actually kind of overlooks their house, I think, as they intended it, to always be able to view their estate from their final resting place. So what we're looking at here is a map of Elm Grove. And kind of follow me here a little bit, because this is a little tricky to explain, but the way I like to break this down is today the National Road, when you're traveling on it through Elm Grove, basically you go behind Respex, okay? So imagine that. You go behind Respex when you are traveling west on the National Road. When Moses gets the plans to build the National Road, all right, it was supposed to go in front of Respex, okay? So the problem with that is if you go in front of Respex, the road isn't going to go past their house, which is on the corner down here, okay? So legend has it, story has it that, they wanted the road to go past their house because look at it, it's magnificent. They also have different small businesses located around their house. And it would be rather inconvenient if it went, again, imagine, like in front of Respex and wasn't directly in front of their house. And so, again, I mean, it's a long story, but, they basically reroute the road to go past their house. And kind of think about this. When you're traveling on the National Road, there's very few places where you just, you're at a red light, okay, and then you just take a sharp right and go in a totally different direction, all right? So to do that, though, bridges had to be built to get it to go past their house. And so you have this bridge that was in use until really like the late 1990s, this massive S bridge that basically this is the Subaru, where I'm standing right now, that's the Subaru dealership, okay, in the Grove, and then you have Peters Run Road, and then this bridge was the first bridge that took you towards their house, or again, what I just like to explain as behind Respex. So you have that S bridge, and then here's another view of the S bridge. So in the background, that would be where the Subaru dealership is. Which again, a lot of you guys probably remember traveling on this bridge, or remember when it was demolished, and there's of course a new bridge in this place right now. And then that took you to their house, and then to the bridge that is actually still in use today or being restored that will be reopened, known as, like, I just call it like the Hump Bridge or the Monument Place Bridge. And both of these bridges were built in 1818, okay? And so this would make this the oldest bridge in the state of West Virginia that will, still be in use today. So this is a really important part to understand about the National Road, is the Shepherds and their influence sort of changes the whole route of that. So the National Road, if I could go back to probably one time in history, This would be one of the eras that I would love to just kind of observe. You know, the national roads, stagecoaches, Conestoga wagons, what it was like to stop at the taverns. For some reason, I just think that this would just be a really neat time to go back and just observe. Wouldn't want to live necessarily during that time period. But when you think of all the wagons and the people traveling on it, it's fascinating. And when you have that bridge today that's currently being restored, that looks like it's almost near completion, that was designed for these wagons, you know, and these stagecoaches. And the fact that you have school buses and trucks and cars traveling on this bridge today, that it was built that well by Moses Shepherd in 1818 is unbelievable, all right? So there's a few pictures of this bridge that are really cool that you can find mostly like on the Ohio County Library's website. But I love showing this to my students because I'm like, look, this is what people did for fun, okay? Back in the day, is they walked around and they took pictures. And like even then, in the late 1890s, like they thought that was a cool bridge, okay? So we should still appreciate something like this today. And I think this is interesting too, because there's a camera in the photo, and then someone's taking the photo. So these people were walking around, exploring, and they got two cameras. I don't know who they are, but they must be pretty wealthy, or again, just that was what they were doing for fun. And then here's another great photo. So there's a lot of great photos of Elm Grove that relate to different floods that happened, and just people out, sightseeing. And this also gives you a really good viewpoint of what the bridge originally looked like, because that railing that was on the bridge and that you'll see in a second they've restored, it wasn't original to the bridge, but yeah, it's a great look of what it originally looked like when Moses built it. And then another neat just viewpoint of the Grove, and again, like every time I see this photo, I kind of have to catch my bearings a little bit, but whoever took this, they're kind of standing, I guess like where the Junior Avenue Bridge is now, looking towards McDonald's, and like over here would be where the pharmacy is, all right? But again, like imagine this era, of the National Road in its heyday with stagecoaches and Conestoga wagons and Elm Grove mostly being a rural area, and then what it is today. It's just amazing how this area, is developed, but it's all here because of the National Road. And it would have looked a little bit different, if the Shepherds didn't use their influence to route it past their house. And then here's a current photo of what the bridge looks like. So like I said, within the near future, this will probably be back open to traffic. And you can see they've redone the railings there, kind of like the cement work on that. But what you got to do is you got to park somewhere and walk over and look underneath all that and at that stonework that Moses put there, because all of that has been repointed and resurfaced, and again, it just looks really cool. So glad to see that that's actually being taken care of. What are the towns that you come across? Okay, so you're leaving Washington. What's the next town that you're going to come across? What's before West Alec? What's before Claysville? Taylorstown. Okay, so you got Taylorstown, you got Claysville, you got West Alexander, you got Dallas Pike, Roney's Point, Triadelphia, Elm Grove, all right, like Pleasant Valley, okay, like Wheeling Park area, okay? So I always ask my students, I'm like, now tell me, what are the towns after Washington? And you guys did really good, but I'm telling you, like, it's probably taken me 10 minutes sometimes to get kids to tell me what's after Washington, PA, because they want to jump to like Dallas Pike. And I'm like, well, no, what's before that? And I'm like, just tell me the exits that you see on the interstate. And this year, this kid, when I asked that question, I'm not kidding, within like 10 seconds, he had all those towns. And it was like, if the history of Wheeling, it was like an Olympic event, he got a gold medal in telling me all those towns. So it's hilarious. But the reason I bring that up is that, you wanted towns to be at different intervals along the National Road for stopping places. So, you have Washington and Taylorstown and Claysville, about 5 to 7 miles apart from each other, because those, again, were the different intervals you wanted to run into a town if you were traveling on the National Road. You didn't want to stretch at 12 miles with nothing, okay? And so I think that's really cool to kind of talk about why those towns are there. When you're traveling on the old National Road in Pennsylvania, they actually have one of the old S bridges. It's no longer used anymore, but it's kind of there on the side as kind of like a monument to the National Road. And as you travel, west, you run into some really historic locations. And so, you guys know this is Roney's Point, but you have that Stonehouse Tavern there that dates to 1818. Flashback in time to what that would have looked like, in 1820 when everyone is traveling on the National Road. You would have had that place jam-packed with people to get a meal, to stay warm, to find a place to sleep. And you would have all walks of life traveling on the National Road. But Roney's Point and that stone house would have been one of those stopping points that, again, like you can still see today. Then, I'm not sure how many people know about this one, but this is in Burkham Court, okay? So, like where the Bella Via used to be, the neighborhood behind that is known as Burkham Court. And this is the Fay Brothers Tavern that was built in 1811. And they built this tavern, the Fay Brothers did, with anticipation of the National Road taking its original route, okay? Like in front of Respects, but the Shepherds, they changed it to go behind their tavern. And supposedly there was a little bit of a feud between the Shepherds and the Fay Brothers, which probably is true. But nonetheless, they would operate this as a tavern for a time period. And again, like this is just the residence today, but that was built in 1811. So, you can drive by and see that. And then again, Burkham Court, just to put into perspective, is just kind of across from the Subaru dealership there. And again, like the Fay Inn even comes up on Google when you search it. So you have that. Then this would have been the Shepherd's Tavern, okay? So remember, they have the road go right past their house. You take a right, you cross the bridge, and their tavern would have sat approximately like where Dairy Queen is right now. So there was their stone tavern. Then your next stopping place, if you wanted to, could have been on Stam's Lane. So again, I love bringing up like place names and locations, but you have Stam's Tavern there, which Stam's Lane is named after, and here's another image of that. And then one of the cool artifacts about Stam's Tavern is the stepping stone. So when those stagecoaches pulled up to a tavern, they stood up really high. So those stagecoaches would have pulled up to a stone something like this. And then, women and people could have stepped off and, gotten to the tavern. That may seem like a simple object, okay, but the stepping stone that was used at Stam's Tavern was donated to the Stifel Center. And if you go like in their garden behind the mansion, the Stifel Mansion, they have that on display there with the plaque and everything telling you it was from, Stam's Lane or Stam's Tavern. And I always show this to my kids, and I'm like, now, you got to go there and you got to step on it. Get up there. Pretend you're getting on a wagon, getting off a wagon. Like, use it, okay? Embrace that artifact. And they look at me like I'm crazy, but every once in a while I have a kid that'll be like, you know what? I was there for dance class and I saw that thing. And they're like, I thought of you. Or they say, I would have had no idea that that was there, okay? But that stepping stone, is a monument to, the old National Road and in those stagecoaches, and how many people would have used something like that, again, someone took the initiative to save is really cool. But so you're at Stam's Lane, or Stam's Tavern. Again, you're going west on the National Road. One of the last places you would have been able to stop at before you get into Wheeling would have been Frank Walter's 2 Mile House, or 2 miles approximately from Wheeling. And I think I showed this to you before already, but this is where like Sheets is and Vance Church is today. Where that tavern is sitting, where that building is, that's where Vance Church is today. So again, to put into perspective of just Elm Grove and then this area and how rural everything was is amazing. So kind of imagine that you're traveling on the National Road and you didn't stop at Stam's Tavern, and it's getting late. You would have stopped there. You would have stopped at Frank Walter's house and stayed the night there, probably before you made your way into Wheeling. So again, like next time you're traveling on the National Road, you're going to start seeing little landmarks like that, or noticing where things once were, or I don't think I really have a picture of it, but National Road mile markers, and how important those were as to telling people how far away you were, to the next town was so important. So then you make your way into Wheeling, and as Wheeling starts to grow, this is kind of going down Wheeling Hill into North Wheeling. Wheeling is starting to grow into a very sizable community, and you can see a variety of different types of buildings there, from wood structures to stone structures. You can see the traffic on the river, and then eventually, we'll get to the Wheeling Suspension Bridge, but we'll have to be a little quick with that, but that's okay. So I wanted to point out a couple other things, just interesting to like taverns in general, is a lot of you guys have probably been to Drovers, okay, in Wellsburg. Wellsburg was one of the other locations they were considering for the National Road. So the history of Wheeling would have been a lot different, okay, if Wellsburg would have gotten that contract. But the Shepherds and their influence, remember, play a big role in that coming through Wheeling. And so Drovers is, which again, you guys may know this, but Drovers is named after an occupation on the National Road, or on just roads in general, of driving or tending animals, or being a drover. So again, like if you've ever been there, you're getting a little bit of what that tavern lifestyle was like. And I also wanted to point out a couple other just interesting things about Elm Grove is the witness tree. That sycamore tree on the corner of the Shepherd property is every bit of 300 years old, and it had some issues with it, like parts of the tree dying, and they had to trim back part of it, but then part of it has miraculously started to come back too. But imagine something like that tree and all the different like eras of Wheeling history that has witnessed. Is it an important artifact or an important thing to our history? And what is this? Does anyone recognize this? The A&P. So I vaguely remember this building, but there's not a whole lot of pictures of Elm Grove from like the 80s and the 90s that I've really seen out there. And so I think like knowing what that area was like before there was a McDonald's is kind of cool. And again, when I showed that to you, I mean, there was no hesitation. You guys knew it was the A&P store. And I think this is funny because, again, sometimes when I think I'm not getting through the kids and they're not listening to me, they'll ask me a question. And the other day I had a kid ask me, they're like, hey, what's that stone wall there in the Grove? And I was like, I don't know. What do you mean? Like, describe this for me. And they're like, well, I was leaving Dairy Queen and, I noticed this wall there. Was it because the hillside's falling down? Like, what was going on? And then it hit me, they're talking about the old railroad viaduct that used to be there, and so then that turned into a whole teachable moment about how the railroad crossed over there. The train station is still there. That's the veterinarian's office today. So those were a couple little like odd things about Elm Grove that I thought I'd throw in there too. So then we're going to kind of fast forward here again, but when you came to Wheeling on the National Road, that was it. Okay, there was no bridge, that took you to the island. There was no suspension bridge. What you had to do was take a ferry, all right? Now, eventually, the Zane family would build this covered bridge that would take you from the island to Bridgeport, okay? But again, from 1818, when the National Road comes to Wheeling, until 1849, you come here and that's it. Okay, you got to wait, be patient, or you can eventually use the covered bridge. So I do feel like when a lot of people came here, they found the job pretty quickly. They settled here. They established here in Wheeling. Okay, but the suspension bridge will change everything. And there's a picture of what would replace the covered bridge that the Zanes built. And you guys will remember this. I just always called it the Blue Bridge or the Bridgeport Bridge, but this was demolished in 2010. But that steel bridge was built on top of the piers that the Zanes put there in 1837. And then in 2010, they demolished the steel Blue Bridge, and those piers, they were taken down with it. But again, a great photo there showing you how low the river could get at different points before the locks and dams. But so a little bit about the suspension bridge. And just again, a little bit about something about my students in my classroom is a couple years ago, I had a girl in class, and she was actually in my government class, but she said, I'm going to make you a replica of the suspension bridge. And I thought, okay, sure you are, like, how are you going to make a replica of the suspension bridge? What do you mean by that? But she kept saying, like, you know, I'm working on this. I'm going to bring this in. You won't believe it. And so, again, I kind of thought, well, what is she talking about? On the last day of school, she came in with this, and it may not look like much in the photo, but she made a replica of the suspension bridge basically out of cardboard, some other little things, and chicken wire. And I was blown away by this. And then she's like, oh, it lights up too, okay? So again, like, I didn't even have this student in the history of wheeling. They just knew that I liked wheeling. And so they brought this in on the last day of school for me a couple years ago. And not too long ago, I ran into her mom, and she was telling me about this. And she's like, that thing took up our dining room table for about 4 months. And she's like, I loved it, because she goes, she's a senior. She's like, I was never going to experience something like that again. So she's like, I did not mind that was on the dining room table for so long. But again, like a cool thing that one of my students made for me about the suspension bridge. So the suspension bridge, the idea starts, in the 1830s for a bridge to cross the main channel of the Ohio River. And, it takes about 20-some years for that to actually become a reality, because that's a huge span to cross. Nothing like that had ever been done before. And when the suspension bridge is built, it's the longest bridge in the world for a short time period. So it was a marvel for the people to come and see. And again, it would connect the national road to Ohio. And as the suspension bridge has been restored for the last couple of years, we've gotten some really unique viewpoints of how it's actually constructed. And it's amazing when you consider, like, it's just wire, okay? It's just wire wound around over and over again and anchored into each side of the Ohio River. So these are just some photos of the construction and of the renovations that allows us to see a little bit more detail of it. And again, this is the fascinating part. And most of this would be, original wires, like from, 1849. There'll be something that had to be restored with the bridge I'll tell you about in a second. But that's how it's all connected there on the Main Street side. So again, back to another wheeling warm-up and bridge edition here. So I know I showed this photo to you maybe in the first class, but these are actually stagecoaches right here parked that came into Wheeling. And so this photo was taken not too long after the suspension bridge was built because of a flood. And many people do not realize this, but the suspension bridge design initially was a lot different. And probably one of the biggest differences, today versus back then was the railing, okay, and the supports that keep the suspension bridge up today. So if you look at this drawing of it, you can see that there's no railing, or it's not the same, or there's no trusses, or there's no like X's that are on the bridge today, all right? So in this photo here, you can see how there's a lot more support of a railing versus in this photo right here. The other thing too is the suspension bridge, originally the deck of it was wood, okay? And so kind of think about this, when you have a lot of wind on the Ohio River, there's nowhere for that wind to go, okay? So it hits the bottom of that bridge and it moves around a lot. And I mean, it moves as it is right now already when you're walking across it. But with no airflow, again, it could really shift a lot. So there wasn't as much support for the bridge. And again, it had a wooden deck. So today, like, we have that wire grate, so that way when the wind blows, it blows right up through there and it'll still move it, but not as much. And so what would happen in 1854 in May, there was a violent windstorm that came through Wheeling, and it actually shook the bridge so much, it actually collapsed into the Ohio River. So all the decking and the wires fell. And this was tragic for Wheeling because, this is what we are known for. We're known for the suspension bridge. It is the gateway to the west. Everyone is using it to cross into Ohio. And we were devastated, but who wasn't devastated was Pittsburgh, okay? Because we were in major competition with Pittsburgh at that time for expansion. And when this bridge collapsed, it was a time of turmoil of what was going to happen to it, because numerous, people had wanted it demolished or torn down because they said it was too low. It was an obstruction to river traffic. And when it collapsed, if you look at the Main Street side, there are some gashes in the stone from where, when the wires snapped, it went back and hit the stone. So it's almost like a scar from that collapse. And again, Pittsburgh was thrilled that it collapsed, and the day after the bridge collapse, there was a steamboat from Pittsburgh traveling through Wheeling, and to mock the Wheeling suspension bridge, it lowered its smokestack, even though there was no bridge there. You know, so again, this was no small matter with this feud between Wheeling and Pittsburgh, and the newspaper reports say that when people from Wheeling noticed what the captain of the steamboat was doing, they went and they threw rocks at the boat. So, good for them. But within a year, it would be rebuilt, and this would actually, again, be a whole nother story, but this would go to the Supreme Court, a case with the Wheeling suspension bridge. And again, Pittsburgh wanted it gone, okay? They wanted to have something, in Pittsburgh that people would use and get people away from Wheeling. But what would ultimately happen is that the Supreme Court would rule that the suspension bridge needs to be kept open because it was used as a postal route, okay? And it's a carrier of commerce or interstate commerce. And so that's one of the things that kept the suspension bridge up and running. And as a government teacher, I get to also use the Commerce Clause, in the history of Wheeling too. So that's kind of cool for me. But the suspension bridges had numerous eras where it was kind of in trouble. I mean, in the 1970s, I'm not really sure, if people thought that it was going to be, kept open or it was in threat of being demolished then. And there's some key people that played a role in keeping it open. And of course, the future of it is for traffic and cars is up in the air. But again, if you've driven past it at night, you get to see it all lit up, and again, you can still walk across it. And again, that is a true monument to transportation. It was built by a guy named Charles Ellet Jr. He built some other bridges too, but that's one of the ones that is still actually standing and still actually preserved that he built. So that's the Wheeling warm-up. That would have been my fact for my kids, but it was May 17th, 1854. There was that storm that destroyed the Wheeling suspension bridge. The towers were okay, but the wires collapsed there. And so as Wheeling develops over time, again, we are still a hub for transportation even today. We would have the steel bridge that would be built in the 1890s and was demolished in the 1960s. There's a nighttime view of that, which some of you guys probably remember the steel bridge, and all that's left of the steel bridge is this railing by the Capitol Music Hall. It's flipped upside down, but that is an original part of the steel bridge there of where it would have connected you over to the island. And then, of course, you got the Fort Henry Bridge. So, again, I try to really portray to my students that, we're still, transportation is still something that keeps Wheeling alive and makes Wheeling a desirable place to live. We have very quick access to other cities, and, it's very convenient for people. So the Fort Henry Bridge was built in 1955. Just something I always kind of throw up for my students to see if they can figure out where this is, but this is the construction of Wheeling Tunnel and the interstate on the east side. And you see Tunnel Green over there in the background. And then again, another view kind of looking over towards the east side there of the tunnel. So again, that's a whole nother important era of Wheeling history that may not really seem that old, okay, but is still really important for us as a town and keeps us on the map. And again, most of my students had no idea that we at one point had 3 bridges up and running at the same time with the Fort Henry Bridge, suspension bridge, and the old steel bridge. And again, it would probably be kind of nice to maybe have the steel bridge back again with the suspension bridge being closed or just with different traffic issues that we may have to have that there. And then as I kind of wrap things up here, a whole nother era that, if you want to know more about, I can direct you towards is streetcars. Wheeling kind of looked like San Francisco. When you look at the old photos of it, you could have taken a streetcar anywhere. You could have taken a streetcar from downtown Wheeling to Roney's Point if you wanted to. This is one going to Warwood. They took you up to Mozart, and they are fascinating when you look at them. I mean, they're just so elegant looking, but also so dangerous because these things could jump the tracks, lose control, lots of accidents, and people would pile on these things and fall off. I mean, look at this little catcher thing that was there to catch people, if you bumped into someone. So incredibly dangerous, but really a fascinating part of Wheeling history. And again, a lot of you guys, if you look at streets or different things like that, you can tell different areas where those streetcars would have ran because you still see signs of those tracks sometimes. So again, that's the super quick version of Wheeling as a gateway to the West.